So as you have undoubtedly noticed, I'm a little behind, or a lot, depending on the case. This is the week 5 discussion of the Atlantic revolutions, which is particularly important because it's here that we get the whole issue of the shift from mercantilism to capitalism conjoining with Enlightenment ideas about race, ethnicity, gender, equality, ideas of democracy, and of course all of the Adam Smith and John Locke theories, among many others, but those are the big ones. So in talking about the Atlantic revolutions, one of the first things you have to do is define what the Atlantic revolutions were. For our purposes, they are principally the North American Revolution against the British government. Some refer to it as American Revolution. I try not to, simply because, as you'll notice in this week, there are a lot of other revolutions occurring in the Americas as well. So the North American Revolution against Britain, this would be in 1776. In 1789, the French Revolution. In 1791, the Haitian Revolution. Then from 1808 to 1826, the Latin American revolutions. Again, the reason why I don't think it's fair to just say the American Revolution, because there were many other ones. And these are all the ones that you should be in the course of this talking about, or at least using referentially. All right, so the question is, what role do race, ethnicity, and gender play in the revolutions in the Atlantic world? Now, the Atlantic world itself is principally Europe, particularly Western Europe, Africa, South Central, and North America. So it's that whole area that borders the Atlantic Ocean. What role do race, ethnicity, and gender play in the revolutions of the Atlantic world between 1750 and 1900? How are these revolutions related to settler colonialism? Why are there no comparable revolutions in the rest of the world? Is liberalism, define it, a purely Western concept? Why or why not? Your required sources for this were, depending on your textbook, the assigned textbook chapters, whether it be Brooks, whether it be Strayer and Nelson, whether it be Wisner Hanks, any of those. It's whichever ones I have listed in the syllabus and in the content page. Frankopan chapter 15, Harari chapter 16, and then whatever multimedia it is that you are using, which you need to identify and specifically discuss. Now, as I've already graded your week 5 discussions, if I've made references to any of this, you need to go back and review that as we go through it, because when I say required, I mean they need to be actually cited in the body of your top post. You may elaborate on them, and I encourage you to elaborate on them in your peer comments, but they must be in the body of your top post. All right. So the first part of it, what role do race, ethnicity, and gender play? Well, we need to define these things because they're all complicated. They're kind of overlapped. In fact, there's a whole academic field called, it's an interdisciplinary field called intersectionality that brings all of these together. The idea that all of these are different roles in a person's identity, and because of that, when they meet, those roles often have to compromise between each other on issues. So race, of course, is a culturally constructed term having to do with effectively defining someone based on the color of their skin. This is an idea that evolves with the Enlightenment, as it were, certainly in the wake of, as Wade and Smedley point out here, Western conquests of the rest of the world beginning in the 15th century. Race, again, is entirely culturally constructed. Biologists will tell you there is no difference between people in terms of their biogenetics or anything else when it comes to comparing them in terms of skin color. Ethnicity refers to the identification of a group based on a perceived cultural distinctiveness that marks the group into a specific type of people. We often think of ethnicity the same way we think of nationalism, because we think of people from one particular part of the world or nation as having a specific type of culture. This would be ethnicity. It is not race. It is not interchangeable with race because it's entirely based on socialization, on history, on family life, religion, food, all of those things that come from a distinctive group of people and how they behave and the behaviors they pass on to their progeny. Gender, of course, is not the same as sex. Sex is a biological identifier that people are given at birth based entirely upon their physical appearance and genitalia. Gender is a person's sense of who they are, whether they are male, female, some combination of male or female, or neither male or female. So it is about a personal identity. For our purposes, historically, we are talking about people who perceive of themselves as either male or female, and how that operates. Well, and of course, you can also look at the history of um, LGBTQ people. You can look at the history of people who define themselves androgynously. It all depends, but in terms of what we're talking about in the broad sense of this course, we're especially talking about gender is based on a male-female dichotomy and how that applies economically, politically, and socially. So we can go in that in more detail as we go along. Historically, societies have been patriarchal, which tends to give to the idea that women were politically, socially, and economically considered to be inferior. All right, so what role do race, ethnicity, and gender play in the revolutions in the Atlantic worlds between 1750 and 1900, which means you also now have to discuss these revolutions. And a lot of you just skimmed right over that without, I don't know, thinking that they were important. They're very important. That's what these chapters were entirely about. The easy connections are these. Race, obviously, intimately involved in the Haitian Revolution because it effectively started as a slave revolt that then goes on to be an actual political revolt when mixed blood peoples in the middle class pick up the slave revolt and utilize it to their advantage as well, especially after they have been rejected by the French theoretically democratic government. It's more of a republican government in the wake of the beheading of Louis XVI. When the Petit Noir, the mixed blood middle class people send representatives to the French Parliament because they want to be included in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and this idea of doing away with slavery. That particular government, the government that's preaching the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, rejects them and says, no, we're basically impoverished right now. This whole revolution started because we're broke and you're our richest colony. So good gosh, no, we can't afford to lose you and we can't afford to lose the income from you. So we are definitely not going to give people of mixed heritage equal rights, even if your fathers were French white men, and we're certainly not going to do away with slavery. They come back from that meeting very disillusioned with this whole idea of France and its revolution, and instead take up with the slaves to extend the revolution to drive the French out entirely, and that's part of why it works. For ethnicity, probably the easiest ones to put your finger on are, of course, the Latin American revolutions, because ethnicity plays a very large role in these, particularly with the native peoples who still reside and still exist in Central and South America, but definitely among the Creoles, who are often mixed blood native and Spanish or Portuguese peoples. And they call upon their native heritage and their native relatives to win support. For gender, the best one is probably the French Revolution because it was driven principally by women, at least in the early stages. I had some of you discuss the flour wars, this idea that the inability to literally buy bread is a big part of what drives the initial protest that set off the war. We also get to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, Olympe de Gouges, all of whom reference the idea that women work just as hard as men and therefore should be considered politically and economically equal. In fact, during the heyday of the idea of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, instead of addressing people by their gender, as we would say mademoiselle or madame or monsieur, they would address each other literally as citizen, taking gender completely out of the construction, on the idea that they're going to be completely equal. That, of course, fails, but that was the ideal in that moment. All right, so what do they all have in common? The biggest thing they all have in common is a transition from mercantilism to capitalism. The revolution in the British colonies against Britain was definitely driven by the desire of the rising middle class of merchants to be able to trade where they wanted to and with whomever they wanted to. It is not a coincidence that the revolution in those colonies starts in the wake of the Seven Years' War, when the British attempt to impose the Navigation Acts, which had actually been passed in the 1660s, but had never been enforced because they didn't feel there was a need to enforce them, because they assumed that the colonists, considering themselves to be good British citizens, would do what they were supposed to. And to be fair, in the 1660s, the North American colonies weren't bringing in that much in the way of um, trade. But by the time you get to the 1750s and 60s, a whole 100 years later, the Britain is heavily reliant upon trade from the colonies in North America. And it's not until the Seven Years' War, or in U.S. history, it's referred to as the French and Indian War, that the British Army comes over, and many of these British military leaders are stationed in the big ports like New York and Boston. And they are looking out their windows as they're writing their reports back to the British command in London. And they're noticing a lot of different ships sitting in the harbors that, by their definition, shouldn't be there. They're noticing ships flying French flags. They're noticing ships flying Dutch flags. They're noticing ships flying Portuguese flags. And they're like, all right, why are these guys here? They're not supposed to be here, because the colonists are only supposed to be trading with Britain. So it's while they're stationed, while they're fighting this war, that the British government comes to understand that the colonists literally have not been upholding their end of the bargain with the Navigation Acts. So at the end of the war, due to that, and this is a 7 Years' War, or French and Indian War, at the end of that war, in lieu of leaving the colonies, the British decide that they're going to keep a standing force on the ground. They argue, not incorrectly, that a big part of the reason for that is because of this other little war that has broken out among Native Americans against the colonists, particularly the British colonists who have taken over the French forts in the Ohio River Valley. And at this point, in order to assuage the Native Americans, the British government promises that no settlers will move into the Ohio River Valley, which really, really upsets the colonists, because a big part of what drove that war was their desire to take over the Ohio River Valley. And in fact, it is George Washington's, not his personal attack on the French, but the attack by his Cherokee allies upon the French that literally started the 7 Years or French and Indian War. So this whole thing is an interesting little complex exercise in literally capitalism, because it is the colonists who want to be able to dispose of their goods as they want to make a profit on selling them, and not to be constrained by the rules placed on them by the British government. It is exacerbated when, in order to save the British East India Company, the British government requires that the colonists buy tea imported from the British East India Company. That tea happens to be bad. It's been molding, and a lot of it is completely unusable. And that leads to the Boston Tea Party, which cost the British millions, in today's value, literally between $5 and $7 million, in terms of the destroyed tea. In turn, the British closed the ports of Boston and New York, saying that they will not be reopened and no trade will go on until the colonists pay for that tea. That is the straw that breaks the camel's back, literally, for the colonists, who actually start arming to resist and subsequently declare their independence from the British government. So basically, wanting to keep their own money, to invest it as they wanted, to sell to whomever they wanted to sell to buy from wherever they wanted to buy, is a big part of what drives the colonists to finally break with Britain. And it is, again, that transition from mercantilism to capitalism that's doing that. In the French Revolution, it's also driven in no small part by this. Harari talks at length about the Mississippi bubble and how much money the French government loses in it. It is the loss of so much money that forces the king to have to recall the Estates General. And through that, the Third Estate, looking to open up the ability to trade more, to invest as they wanted to invest, and not be controlled by the government, begins to demand more rights. When this leads to problems for the other two estates, the top two estates, the aristocracy and the church, they attempt to hold meetings without the Third Estate, which drives the Third Estate to its own private meeting on the nearby tennis courts, which leads to what is called the tennis court oath. It is exacerbated by the lack of affordable food, which leads to the flower wars, which leads to women marching, and then men and women both marching, and eventually to the attack on the Bastille, and the subsequent events that lead to the actual execution of Louis XVI. The revolution goes to such extremes that it eventually arrives at what's called the Reign of Terror, when radicals led by Robespierre effectively take over the country as a whole and attempt to do away with anybody who they believe has any aristocratic blood or any aristocratic leanings. The Reign of Terror only lasts about less than a year, I think. The reaction to it, though, is that the governments that take control thereafter are effectively corrupt. They can't salvage the situation with the economy, which eventually leads to Napoleon returning from his conquests, particularly in Egypt, and taking control of the government itself, mainly because the people had become so frustrated with the ineptitude of the government that by 1799 they were willing to throw themselves behind behind Napoleon. Unfortunately, Napoleon himself isn't going to manage to make things much better. He does actually kind of salvage the economy with his many wars, but then he ends up in war. The French are at war with almost everybody in Europe. While they conquer a lot of places, it is virtually impossible to retain control of that. So it's going to be on another 50 years before capitalism actually becomes the de facto economic principle of France. And then, of course, the Haitian Revolution, which again starts as a slave revolt. It almost fails. Auger is captured and executed. Many of the leaders in the first phase are. But when the Petit Noir contingency returns from France bearing the bad news, the French refuse to recognize Haiti as being equal or even principally giving it any kind of independence at all, not doing away with slavery. The Petit Noir align themselves with the slaves, especially with the new slave leader, Toussaint Louverture. Now, to be fair, Louverture himself was not a slave. He was a former slave. He owned a lot of property, and he even owned slaves. But he took up basically with the Petit Noir on the idea that they should be able to do what they wanted to do. So even though the Spanish, the British, and even Napoleon himself attempt to retake the island, they all fail. Napoleon's forces do capture Louverture, who dies in a French fortress, but the revolution itself is actually won by Louverture's right-hand man, Jacques Dessalines. And a lot of the reason that they win is because, interestingly enough, that little strange irony, that yellow fever, among other diseases, have mutated in Haiti, and the French now have no resistance to them. So many French military people die from yellow fever and various other diseases. But substantially, while we think of it as a slave revolt and the most successful slave revolt, it would not have succeeded without the help and support of the free mixed race middle class who wanted to move past mercantilism into capitalism. All right. The Latin American revolutions, very much like the North American revolutions, in that it's driven by the middle class people of most of Central and South America. The Creole people, people who were born of mixed parentage, usually, not always, but usually European men and Native or African women in the colonies. Um, in this respect, in the same way that Haiti had the Petit Noir, the Spanish have these Creoles in the middle class who have been set up in businesses or professions by their European fathers, who have been told they can't go back to Europe to practice, so they are going to stay in the colonies, because most of these European men are only in, the Spanish possessions and the Portuguese possessions in the Western Hemisphere for 10, 15, or 20 years, and then they must return to their first families back in Spain and Portugal. So they don't want their illegitimate children coming with them. So they set them up in these businesses and these professions, but because of the nature, again, of mercantilism, these peoples are restrained in how much money they can make, because so much of it has to be paid in taxes and so much trade is controlled by the Spanish and the Portuguese governments. The main leaders in South America were Jose Martin and Simón Bolivar. In Mexico was Miguel Hidalgo, Father Miguel Hidalgo. In the case of all of the Spanish or Latin American revolutions, they all gained the support of slaves because they all promise to do away with slavery. They gained the support of people of African descent, mulattoes, Amerindians, mestizos, and Creoles. Across the board, they pretty much promised an end to slavery, land redistribution to the poor, particularly to the Amerindians, mestizos, and mulattoes, and respect for mixed blood peoples in the constitutions, effectively elevating them to levels of equality. Brazil will take the longest to actually end slavery. They're not going to do it till 1888, even though it had begun to die out by then. So even though they make these promises, a lot of times these are long in coming. All right, so how are these revolutions related to settler colonialism? Well, the first thing is you got to bear in mind what settler colonialism is. Many of these revolutions are not at all related to settler colonialism, because settler colonialism is principally something that the British do. The Spanish don't remove, and the Portuguese don't remove the Native Americans from the land. They can't afford to. They need them to do the work. What the British do, though, is begin to move over large numbers of British people themselves and to take the land away from the Native Americans and dispossess them. So it's principally the British who are going to do this. The main revolutions associated with it, Revolution of the British Colonies of North America. In France, that revolution was mostly internal, though it does lead to the Haitian Revolution. But again, the Haitian Revolution was not technically the people of what would become Haiti, the Haitians themselves, were actually dead. They'd already been eradicated. So for the most part, there was not settler colonialism in Haiti. The Latin American revolutions mostly driven by the middle class who are allied with the lower classes. So it's principally only the North American revolutions against Britain that have an edge of settler colonialism in it. And you could go to a direct example of that in the fact that in 1760, at the end of the French and Indian War, the British attempt to protect the natives by telling the colonists that they can't move into the Ohio River Valley. The colonists reject that. They reject that claim because they want to move in and take the land away from the Native Americans because it is such lucrative land. It grows so well. So in that respect, their whole intent, by the time we get to the actual start of the British colonies' revolution against Britain, was to be able to take the land that they wanted to take and to move the natives off of it. The English British are principally going to practice settler colonialism in North America, Australia, and in their island possessions in the South Pacific, where they either genocidally eradicate the natives or force the natives to move, to the point that the natives often become extinct. All right, so why are there no comparable revolutions in the rest of the world? Many of you gave me the hodgepodge statements about different social structures and different expectations. But what are the examples of that, right? So Buddhism and Confucianism led to less individual, more collective concept of one's place in society. As I've mentioned before, they and Hinduism, all three have what is called, to me, the long game. You are born into a specific role in your society for this lifetime. If you hope to get out of the cycle of rebirth, you have to do what is told to you during the cycle. So they were less likely to get into direct revolt unless something really extreme happened, like massive starvation of them and their families. There were some revolts. Frankopan talks about one within Muslim societies. But the interesting thing about that particular revolt was that it was actually a revolt about overthrowing their own rulers. It was not so much about overthrowing their own rulers as it was about throwing the Europeans out. So while there are some revolts, it has a lot more to do with ideas of imperialism and being controlled externally. All right. All right, liberalism. Now, I asked you to define it. Most of you did, but very few of you actually gave me your citation for it, which is very annoying. Liberalism is a political and economic doctrine that emphasizes individual autonomy, equality of opportunity, and the protection of individual rights, primarily life, liberty, and property. It's originally against the state and later becomes against both the state and private economic actors. In the 1700s and 1800s, was it a purely Western concept? Yes, but it spreads into other cultures by way of the Europeans who have colonized them. And it's going to be a major concept at play during decolonization in the 1900s, which many of you did point that out. All right, so Harari and Frankopan. Harari argues that capitalism is a big part of what causes the Atlantic revolutions, as he points out. Capital trickles away from dictatorial states that fail to defend private individuals and their property. Instead, it flows into states upholding the rule of law and private property. And that is at the end of that example where he's talking about why the two Dutch brothers who are sent off with money, one of them goes to Spain where he loses almost everything. And in fact, the father has to pay for his return. And that is part of the argument for why Spain ultimately goes bankrupt. Frankopan, the chapter opens with the loss of the North American colonies to Britain, definitely referencing the British colonies, and how that sets the tone for British stronger show of force against Russia. And the bulk of that chapter is about the British attempts to keep Russia out of play in the Middle East. Also through it, he discusses the history of Russia in this period as it evolves into an empire and as it turns away from Enlightenment ideology of Western Europe. All right, so there's my works cited. If you have questions about this, please let me know. I'm going to go ahead and post this, and then I may do the next one from week 6 on the isms. If not, I will get that out to you in the next day or so.